Hello everybody, and welcome to my video on the Yashica Lynx-1000, a very interesting camera that I came across with a lot of about 8 or 9 other rangefinders, and I looked at it and I thought, well, that's an amazingly fast leaf shutter, and it has a 1/1000th of a second leaf shutter lens. So very interesting camera, and we're going to go through all of this camera because it is a very, very nice camera, and if you can get your hands on a working one like this one, then it is a camera that will do very well by you. So the Yashica Lynx-1000 is a 35mm rangefinder camera. Now what that means is that it uses any 35mm film, and because this has a very fast shutter speed, you've got some pretty good flexibility in terms of 35mm films. It is a rangefinder camera, which means there are 2 windows here and a series of mirrors inside of the camera that combine these 2 views into a single image that you see through the back of the camera's viewfinder, and that you use, and those image overlays adjust when you focus, allowing you to get a very precise focus with your camera. It has a photovoltaic scene meter right up here. That is your scene meter, and if I recall correctly, there's a battery for this one inside. Or is that the 14? That's the 14. Okay, so this has a selenium cell meter, which does not need a battery. Right there is a photovoltaic selenium light meter. A leaf shutter. Shutter speeds, as I said, of 1/1000th at the fast end, a full second on the slow and bulb. And the flash sync on this camera, because it is a leaf shutter, is any of the shutter speeds. The target market for the Yashica Lynx-1000 was the advanced or high-end user. The combination of the shutter speed on this, as well as the very fast lens, which at the time a 45mm f1.8 was a pretty darn fast lens, and then the scene meter here would have made this a very high-end rangefinder. And in addition, it also has excellent build quality, very stately finishing. Yashica always did a very good job of making their cameras attractive looking, and this is no exception. This is a very, very good looking camera. It also has rangefinder parallax correction. Now what that means is that when you have the rangefinder here, it's seeing the exact same scene twice to overlay the images, but from a slightly different perspective, in the same way that we have 2 eyes, in the same way that that binocular vision works to allow our brains to determine depth. That's how the rangefinder works. 2 different scenes overlaid. You can adjust focus to obtain depth. Now, one of the issues with this system is that when you get to within about 8 feet of the front of the lens, what's in this window and what's in this window are different than what's going to be in the lens and on the image. So as you focus this lens closer to its closest focus point of 2.6 feet, which is 0.8 meters, the framing lines inside of the viewfinder adjust so that as you look at the framing lines, they are always accurate to what will be on your film. It also has an exceedingly thorough design and layout, and everything on this is designed to make the camera very, very easy to use and very user-friendly, and we'll see that throughout the course of this video. And it also has a very large ISO range. On the lens here, I'll show you in a little bit how to adjust the ISO, but the ISO range on this camera is 10 to a blisteringly fast 800. And back when this camera was released, that was blisteringly fast. These were made by Yashica Company Limited in Japan from 1960 until 1962. It was preceded by nothing directly, at least nothing with the Lynx name. This kicked off the Lynx model lineup, which lasted for the Lynx 1000, 5000, 14, and 14E in that order. And the first 2 of these, the 1000 and I believe also the 5000, but I don't have one of those to verify. I think those first 2 had 1/1000th of a second shutter speeds. The 14s both had 1/500th of a second shutter speeds because they had a faster f1.4 lens. And you can also see how much larger the Lynx-14 is compared to the 1000 and how much larger this front element is. And this is why it has a slightly slower maximum shutter speed than the 1000, because there's just a whole lot of space for the leaves in the 14 to cover. It was concurrent with the Yashica's 44A, 44LM, the Yashica Matte LM, the Yashica Matte Auto, and the Yashica Penta J, and it was followed by the Lynx 5000. So if you have your Yashica Lynx-1000, we're going to go over what all of the different things on the camera are. And then after we do that, then we're going to cover what all of them do. So on the top of the camera here, well, technically on the sides, these are the strap lugs, and this is missing split rings, but for this type of strap lug, you would grab a couple of split rings and put them through the strap lug and then connect your camera strap to those split rings. Here we have the film rewind knob and lever, which is shockingly difficult to get out if you've got no fingernails. Oh, it's because I was doing it on the wrong side. Maybe if I'd been doing it on the right side, that would have worked. So when you rewind your film, this is what you would use to rewind your film. That is the film plane indicator, so if you're doing something like high magnification microscopy or high magnification macro work, you can get an exact measurement from your film plane to your subject for very precise exposure calculations. This is an accessory cold shoe. It will hold a flash, but it will not trigger the flash because there's no hot shoe connection in the center. Maker, Yashica. External light meter display. Very nice feature, by the way. Older film cameras that have the light meter displaying on the outside are few and far between, but the models that had it, it is very nice to be able to get your meter reading off of this while you have your camera either in your hand or on a tripod or on a table or a fence post, whatever, and be able to adjust your settings here without looking through the viewfinder every time you make an adjustment. Serial number, Japan for where it was made, shutter button, film advance lever, film frame counter, frame count index. On the front of the camera, we have here the light meter window, Yashica Lynx-1000. This is the rangefinder window and the viewfinder window. Here is the whole lens, and then here is the flash PC port. This is what you will plug your flash into to use it. I'll show you a little bit more about that later in the video. On the lens itself, there are a number of different things. This is the focus ring right here. There's a little knob thingy that you can put your fingers on to help with focus. But as you adjust this, this moves the lens out to focus closer and in to focus nearer. Focusing scales. This is your aperture setting. This is a fully manual camera, and it has a stepless aperture. Some people will call this declicked. It's only called declicked if it had click stops and someone removed it. This camera did not include click stops, and so it is called stepless. ASA window right here. ASA and ISO are the exact same thing. This is currently set to 400. 400 ASA is exactly the same as 400 ISO. When ASA, the American Standards Association, stopped taking care of film speed testing and ISO took over, they just adopted the DIN and the ASA numbers, and that's how we have the current ISO rating system. This is the shutter dial right here, where you can select your shutter speed from 1/1000th to 1 second. More than a second on this camera. Like way more. There we go. Old leaf shutters do tend to get a little bit sticky on the slow shutter speeds. Down here on the bottom we have, this is the actual ASA selection switch right here. So when you want to select your ASA, this is what you use, or your ISO, it's a correct contemporary term. This is your self-timer lever. I'm not going to demonstrate that because I have a terrible track record with self-timers on old rangefinders jamming the shutter. That's everything on the lens. On the camera's back, not too much to see here. We've got the viewfinder window. This is the actual film door, and we'll see that open in just a moment. On the camera's bottom, this is your film back release, tripod socket, and film rewind button. To open the back of the camera, we push this button down and push it that direction, and then the film back pops open. Inside of the camera, what we have are the film cassette chamber right here, and we have these 4 silver rails are the 4 film guide rails. And when you have film loaded, the top and bottom rails keep the film from moving up and down so that it doesn't get crooked inside the camera. And then these 2 inner rails work with the film pressure plate right here to keep the film sandwiched flat on plane so that the lens focuses correctly. This is the lens opening, and you might be able to see in the lens opening there is some shapes in here, like these ones right here. Those are light baffles that are designed to reduce internal reflections. So there's some thoughtful design in the inside of the lens shutter opening right there. There's a lens baffle right here where this frame is, and then there's a second one around the inside of the camera right there. Here we have the film tension sprocket, and when you advance the film, that spins to help the film move smoothly through the camera and to prevent it from being taken back into the cassette, because over time plastic builds up a memory, and that memory can lead to the film being pulled back into the cassette if the tension sprocket doesn't do its job. When you press the film rewind button, now the tension sprocket can spin freely. Here's the film take-up spool. There is an ASA or ISO to DIN conversion table that was glued on the inside of mine. I assume that's standard, but I don't know. Normally these go on the outside, so it's interesting to see it on the inside of the camera. This is the film pressure plate, and this is these knobs right here don't quite look like they would be the film cassette spring. I'm going to guess that there was a spring attached to these at some point, which would have basically been like a little flat silver paddle shaped thing that has been lost. So while we have this open, let's grab a roll of film and load it into the camera. One of the things I always enjoy about old cameras is a bit of their history. And you can see in this one that it was either sold, or no, it was not sold. It was repaired by somebody on, it's either March or August, I can't tell which because there's some wear to the sticker, 12th of 1968. And it has to have been a repair because it was after this was made, and there's also signatures on there. And it was not uncommon for repair people to put their initials on the cameras that they repaired. And it showed a sign of the quality. If someone puts their name on a thing, then they're probably going to do their best to make the results from it pretty good. So to load the film, we're going to take our roll of film right here, and we're going to drop it into the film cassette chamber and plunk the film rewind knob into place. Pull out a leader, and we're going to load it into that little slot right there on the film take-up spool. Next, we're going to make sure the shutter's been triggered. Advance the film. I'm going to do that again because I was pretty sure that was going to pop off the film take-up spool, but it didn't. Very uncommon on this channel that I do this correctly the first time. Next, we're going to close the back of the film door. Now, the frame counter has to be manually reset. So whenever you load the film, always load it to that red triangle. And now we're going to advance it 3 frames until we get to the first. I could have sworn this one counted down, but I was wrong. So anyway, we advance it 3 frames, and now we're at the first frame. And I'm going to take any slack out of the that there is out of the film here by just spinning this backwards a bit. And now what I want you to look at when I advance the film next is what happens to this rewind knob. You can see that it spins in this direction because the film's being taken off out of the film cassette and pulled through the camera, which we'll see in a moment. So if you have film in the camera and you take out the slack and this spins counterclockwise whenever you advance the film, then you know that the film has been loaded correctly and it's being taken through the camera. Just like that. Now you go through your day and you're taking your photos and you're using your film. Here we go, just like that. And you can see the frames are counting up as we go. I want you to understand that film is one and done. and it can record light exactly one time in a controlled manner through a proper shutter speed and aperture, based on your lighting conditions, of course, or in an uncontrolled manner by doing this. If you do this with your film after you take all of your photos, or even before you take all of your photos, you will get no photos back. What's happened opening the film like this is that all of the photons that can be absorbed by this film have been. So if this were to go off to the lab to be developed, it would just come back with the negatives being black. There would be nothing whatsoever recorded on this. If I had already taken real photos, they'd all be erased. If I had not yet used it and just pulled it out of the cassette to see what it looked like, it would not be able to record any photos. So, important thing to know, not to accidentally do that. But it's important to see what's happening inside your camera when you take a photo. So after you take your photo, you can see here, this is approximately where the shutter opening is. When you take a photo, the film advances beyond that. Pulls it out of the cassette and advances. Now, again, remembering to keep your film door closed this whole time. Still cannot pop this thing open. Even doing the right side of it, I can't. There we go. Okay. There we go. Now, when you go to rewind your film, again, keeping the film back closed this whole time, you'll hold down the film rewind button. And then the camera, as you rewind the film will be rewound back through the camera and into the cassette. There is a very quiet sound that you will probably be able to hear outside of the camera right when the film cassette comes off of the take-up spool. And at that point, you know you're very close to done, and you want to continue rewinding the film all of the way until it's inside the cassette. Now, I need to use this film in another video, so I'm going to save it. But in real life, you want to rewind your film until there's no leader. That tells you in the future that the film has been used and should be sent off to the lab. Leaving a leader out like this makes it very easy to accidentally reuse the film and get double exposures over the whole roll and probably ruin all of your shots. Now, you've taken out that roll of film. You can either keep on shooting, loading up another roll of film, or if you are done for the day, just close your film back, make sure you've triggered your shutter, and you're set to go. All right, next let's talk about how to use the flash on this camera. That's where you're going to connect your flash. And there's no hot shoe, so the only way to connect your flash is with a PC cable, which has a port that looks like this right here. It's a little round plug, and it plugs into that little flash PC port cable right there on the camera body, and then this plugs into the flash. If your flash does not have the ability to accept a PC cable, what you need to do is get a flash hot shoe to PC adapter, which is basically, it's just a hot shoe that slides into this cold shoe, and then there's a cable that comes down here to power the flash on your camera. So those are two options. Of course, if you wanted to get really fancy, you could use the PC cable here to plug in an RF adapter, things like that. The sky is the limit. What we're going to talk about are the basics. So you plug your flash in here, and then you can mount it on top of the camera. A little bit of technique talk. Let's pretend this is a flash. This is the absolute worst place to put a flash. When your flash is on top of your camera, the light leaves the flash, reaches your subject, bounces back to your lens, and because the light was flat like this, your subject ends up looking flat and waxy. It's not a good look for anyone. So if you have to keep your flash on top of your camera, what you want to make sure you have is a flash with an articulating head where you can bounce the light up and off of the ceiling, or if there's no ceiling, off of a wall nearby. Now, why is that? If you think about how we see anybody, ever, if we're outside standing underneath the sun, we are seeing people lit from above by the sun. If we're standing indoors underneath overhead lighting, we're seeing people lit from above by that lighting. Same thing outside at night under street lights. Our brains are programmed to seeing people who are, or any subject really, that's lit from above as being lit naturally and flatteringly. So to set yourself up for success and to set your subjects up to look their best, you want to use your flash to mimic real lighting conditions. So that's why having a flash that bounces up off the ceiling, down to your subject, back to your lens, gives you a more realistic looking subject and a more flattering image of that subject. So for this camera, just any basic flash will do. An old Vivitar like a 2500 or a 283 or a 285, a Sunpack or a Focal or any of those other off brands will work. You can walk into your local camera store, just ask them for the cheapest, most basic brand new flash they have, and it will work on this camera. And it will work at any shutter speed. Now the reason it works at any shutter speed is that leaf shutters have a series of overlapping leaves that close to prevent light passing through the lens and reaching the film plane. When you take a picture, those leaves open to get out of the way, and then they close again. I mean, actually, I guess technically they do this, but you get the idea. They open and then close. They always open very quickly, and then they close very quickly, and then the shutter speed is determined by the speed at which they are open and then close. When you use a flash, as soon as they open up, the flash triggers, light moves at, well, the speed of light, gets to your subject into the film before the leaves even know what's happened, and then they close. And that's why 1/1000th of a second can accept a standard flash on this camera, whereas with a focal plane camera you might be limited at 1/60th, 1/125th, or 1/250th. So that is a very, very nice application of for using this camera if you want to use outdoor daylight fill flash. Okay, so that's pretty much using your flash. Oh, and one other thing, because you have to connect it with a PC port, one technique you can use to set yourself up to use a flash well is to get what's called a flash bar. And it's like basically a flat piece of metal with a 1/4-20 socket here, and then you screw one side into your camera and one side into your flash. You connect the flash with the PC socket, and now you have it off to the side. If you shoot in portrait orientation, you have it up above, but you can angle that flash however you want because it's just screwed into this bar. So it gives you a lot of flexibility when using your flash and your lighting, and this camera was really intended to be used that way. Next thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about the rangefinder use on this camera, and we're going to go not too in-depth with this, but basically, actually we're going to go pretty in-depth with this. So we've got these two windows here on the front, the rangefinder and the viewfinder window. The scene is seen, what you are looking at reaches your eyes through two windows, right? So you've got the viewfinder window here, the light comes in through the window straight to your eye. You've got the rangefinder window here, the light comes in through it, bounces through a couple of little lenses and a couple of mirrors to be overlaid. There's a pellicle mirror here that's on the diagonal, and then this image and the one coming from this rangefinder are overlaid. And so when you look through the viewfinder, you'll see an image with a little tiny magenta goldish colored square in the middle. And what you want to do is, let's say that you're going to take a picture of this hand because that's an exciting subject. It might look something like this when you initially look at it. As you adjust the focus, that overlay is going to do this. And you want to adjust the focus until the hand overlays the hand. I don't have two left hands, so pretend that these are two left hands and you get the point. So when you have your two images overlaid in your viewfinder window, you've achieved focus. And so what you can do is have that focus be the dominant eye of the person you're taking a portrait of, or a rock in the foreground of your background, or whatever it is. And that's how you're going to use the rangefinder. So basically they are calibrated and they're precise and they're accurate. And if it's not too hard for a repairman to go in and make some adjustments to make it accurate again. The first time you use this camera, if you want to verify the accuracy of your rangefinder, what you do is you go out, set it to infinity, and find focus on something that is at infinity. The technical definition of infinity is 200 times the 45mm focal length, or 4.5 cm as this is marked. So you could call infinity the other side of the block of the street you live on, or the tree at the corner of a long rural driveway, something like that, right? So you want to take a picture of that set to infinity, and then you want to set your focus to the closest focus distance and find something that is in focus on your rangefinder at that distance and take a picture of it. If those two photos come back with, and also using the fastest shutter speed you can to obtain the minimum depth of field possible. If you can shoot at f1.8, that's perfect. Even at f4, you're still going to be able to figure out what you need to know. When you get that roll of film back, if those two test photos are both in focus, then you know that your rangefinder is calibrated accurately. And that's a good thing. It's what you want. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is talk about using the lens and understanding how all of the markings work. Because there's a lot on here, and there are some things in here you might not be familiar with. Focus ring, pretty self-explanatory. Aperture dial, pretty self-explanatory. All you have to do is adjust this to select your aperture. Shutter speed selection, also pretty self-explanatory right here. And then once you load your film, I neglected to mention this, when you load your film, you want to adjust the ISO to your film speed. What you need to do is just look through that little window there and adjust your ISO with this lever down here on the side until you have the ISO that you want. Anywhere from 800 to as slow as 10. Okay. So now I'm going to set this a little bit faster because we're going to look at the light meter in a minute. But now we get to these markings right here, your focus scales. So let me turn this around so you can read it correctly. These focus scales, you might recognize some of those numbers, 4, 8, 16, and 22 as being 4, 8, 16, and 22. And if you put that together, you are correct. These numbers represent your aperture, and they line up with the distance markings on your lens. So let's say we're at f8, and we want to have something that is at infinity be in focus, as well as something that's closer. We can take the infinity mark, and we can slide that on over to f8 just like that. And now looking at these focusing scales, everything from this f8 to this f8 is in focus. So that's roughly 5 meters. It's not marked exactly, it's approximately 5 meters out to infinity is going to be in focus. That's not really enough. What if we went up to f16? Well, let's slide the infinity over to f16. So f16 to f16, now we know everything from about 1.9 meters, which is about 6 feet, out to infinity will be in focus. Okay, maybe that is enough. If you went out to f22, your lens's hyperfocal distance, meaning the most that can possibly be in focus, is from f22 to f22, which is about 1.5 meters or about 5 feet out to infinity. At an aperture faster than f4, which would be 1.8 or 2.8, your depth of field is going to be shallow enough that they don't mark it on here. Okay, great. What about f11? It's not marked. I'll just split the difference between 8 and 16, and you will be close enough to get the proper things in focus. And you can see that goes from infinity to just a little bit beyond 2 meters, about 8 feet. And that's how you read the focusing scales on your lens. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is the light meter. There are 2 light meter displays on this camera here on top of the camera's body and then in the viewfinder. The one in the viewfinder looks like this. This is your viewfinder window, and then at the top of the viewfinder, this is very exaggerated, is a rectangular cutout with a golden circle inside of it. And then within that golden circle, there's a green, let's pretend that's green, needle that moves back and forth. And as you adjust your shutter speed and aperture, it's going to move around. And what you want to do is get your needle in the middle like this. When the meter needle is in the middle of that green circle, you know you have a proper exposure. And then if you are way over or way under, it's going to go so far outside of this window that you won't be able to see it. It is, by the way, a little bit tricky to see the light meter display in the viewfinder on this camera. It is not well illuminated. So on top of the camera, there's a similar match needle display right here. And as you can see, if that's not going to work, let's see if I can do it this way. There we go. You might be able to see that needle moving to over very dramatically when I put the studio light right in front of it. And here it should be moving to under, but it's not really doing a good job of that. So at any rate, to use this properly, you want to have that green needle match up with the green line. When you do that, you have a proper exposure. If your green needle is up here and over, you're giving too much light to the film, and what that will do is make your negatives what's called very thick, dense, or dark. 3 words that mean the exact same thing. There's too much light on the film. The negative comes back very black. You'll have long print or digitization times, reduced contrast, whether you print or digitize, and lots of digital noise if you digitize. For under, what's going to happen is exactly the opposite. Not enough light reaches the film, and that means that your negatives are going to be thin, which is another, or it's a term that means not enough light hit, and basically you'll have very fast shutter times or development times with very little contrast, and also very little detail in the shadows and highlights. If you're intentionally doing high key or low key images, you can. And this will tell you over is high key, under is low key. Unless you are doing that on purpose to either learn how to do it or because you know how to do it, what you want to do is get the 2 needles to line up. And one of the nice things about this camera is because it has a stepless shutter speed, or stepless aperture rather, you have a very precise amount of control with the aperture to obtain proper exposures. Okay. So that's how you use the light meter, and basically it's a fully manual camera, so as you adjust your settings, the light meter is going to, the needle is going to adjust to tell you whether or not you have a proper exposure. So we've gone through basically everything on the camera. Let's put this together and talk about how to take a photo. So taking a photo with this camera is pretty easy. The first thing you want to do is get your settings dialed in. So once you have your settings dialed in for the lighting that you're going to use, it makes it a lot easier just to take the photo. So if we adjust our settings here, we know that, let's say, f5.6 and 1/125th of a second is a proper shutter speed. Make sure that our shutter is armed, and then we can take our picture when we're ready. We're not there yet. I accidentally took a photo and wasted a frame. Dang it. Okay, so what you're going to do is look through your viewfinder here, and you're going to arrange your photo. You're going to set it up, compose it, and get ready to take a photo. You're going to obtain your focus, and then as soon as you have the thing in focus that you want to have be in focus, take your picture. And you can do that as quickly as you get focus because you've preset your settings before putting the camera up to your eye. If you put the camera up to your eye first and then go into dial the settings, that will slow down your ability to take a photo when you want to. Okay, so and then afterwards you just advance the film and you're done. That's super simple. What about a double exposure? Double exposures are doable on this camera. I tend to recommend not doing double exposures on older rangefinders just because they are mechanically complex cameras, are also old, and doing a double exposure is not necessarily the easiest thing on the mechanisms. But I'm going to show you how to do it anyway, just to make sure you do it properly. So the mechanics of taking a double exposure are: you take your first photo, you hold down the film rewind knob, you hold down the film rewind button on the bottom here, and then you advance the film to rearm the shutter, and then you take your second photo, and then you advance the film. That's the mechanics. We'll get into the details of that in a second. The science behind it is that if you shoot 2 frames worth of light onto film, onto a single piece of film, you will get, again, a thick, dense, or dark negative. So if we know that f5.6 and 1/125th of a second is a proper single exposure, we need to cut the amount of light reaching the film in half for a double exposure. So to that end, there are 2 ways we can do that: by adjusting the aperture or by adjusting the shutter speed. So with the aperture, you can adjust it to f8. If you said f8, you would be correct. These are fractions, so the higher the number, the smaller the opening, the less the light. Each one of these marked numbers from 28 to 22, the amount of light from 5.6 to 8, 8 is half the light of 5.6. 11 is half the light of f8. Conversely, f5.6 is twice the light of f8. From f2.8, it's f2 is the next stop. f1.8 is really darn close to f2. It's a third of a stop away. If you're down here doing double exposures, f1.8 is close enough to 2. Okay, so we can either do f8 and 1/125th of a second, but we really want to keep f5.6 because we're going to do a portrait. We're going to be focused here at about 3.5 feet or 1 meter, just to get a really close-up portrait. We want to have a nice depth of nice blurry background on that part of the double exposure. So we want to use f5.6. So we can also control that with the shutter speed. Take a guess which way we're going to go. If you guessed 60 because that's turning the dial the same way as the aperture, that would be wrong. We're going to go to 1/250th. Again, these are fractions. So the higher the number, the shorter the time, the less the light. 1/250th of a second is half as much time as 1/125th, half as much light. 1/125th is twice as long as 1/250th, double the light. So we're going to take our first photo at 1/250th and f5.6. We're going to hold all the stuff down while we advance the film. Okay, great. Now we're going to take our second photo. If we're taking a photo at this moment in the same lighting conditions, we just take the photo and go. If we're going to wait a few hours, let's say we want to have a portrait overlaid with a sunset, and sunset's not for an hour or two. What we're going to do at that sunset is we're going to take a different meter reading, and let's say that sunset requires us to do 1/30th at f4 because we're waiting until the sun's pretty much down and we're just getting some color in the clouds, some remnant dark color in the clouds. Well, this is a proper exposure. We need to, again, cut this in half. So we're going to use 1/60th of a second, take our picture, and then advance our film. Now, the next thing we need to do is take a dead frame. And for that, we're going to go to f22 and 1/1000th, and either put your hand over the lens or put your lens cap on, and then take your dead frame. The reason that you take your dead frame is that when you take your double exposure, when you advance the film, after your double exposure, the film gearing in here that advances the film takes a moment to re-engage. And so the film might not entirely exit the opening for the shutter. So when you take your next image, you'll get some overlap. That could easily ruin both of your frames. So you take that dead frame to finish advancing your film beyond the shutter opening so that even though you might waste half of a frame on your roll, you don't waste two photos and all of that work and patience to get those photos. So the dead frame is just a way of ensuring that you get the best results from your double exposure. So some tips. This is a new section to the video, by the way. The tips. This was a suggestion from one of you viewers. I forget who off the top of my head, who wanted tips on how to use the cameras. So I do have a couple of pointers in addition to everything we've gone over in this video to help set you up for success. This is a scene meter, which means everything in front of it, not just what the lens is going to see. Everything in front of it. This has a much wider view than the lens. This will register that light. If you are taking a picture and the sun is way off to the corner, it's not going to be in your photo, but it's way off to the corner. This is going to capture that light from the sun, and that could really throw off your exposures. So one thing you can do if you want to verify your exposures, let's say you're outside and it doesn't matter what lighting conditions you're in. You're on a sidewalk or you're near some grass, something with a neutral tone. You can take a meter reading off of that neutral tone. Don't have your shadow in it, just get the same lighting that everything else is in, and then take your meter reading on that neutral tone subject, and that will give you an accurate scene meter reading from this meter. Whereas, like I said, if you have the sun off to the corner, even if it's not in your image, it could throw off your meter reading. Next thing is, let's say that you're out at a cafe, there's bright sun in the background, you want to take a picture of a friend you're with who's under the shade with you. If you just take a scene reading with this camera, it's going to read for that bright background, your friend is just going to be a silhouette. So what you want to do is you want to grab your camera, you want to jam the meter up into their face like this, just get it right up in there until they're really uncomfortable. Not quite that bad, you don't have to go that far. But what you want to do is get this scene meter to within about a foot of your friend, maybe a little bit less. And that's going to give you a more accurate reading of the light that's on your friend's face. And it will account for the ambient lighting, but it will not bias for the very, very bright background. The exact same is true with a dark background and your friend sitting underneath a light. You take the meter reading off of your friend, you dial in your settings then for that meter reading, and then you go back, compose your image, and your friend will be properly exposed, and the background will either be very bright or very dark, but that's okay because the friend is what you want to take the photo of. And I think those are realistically the best 2 tips that I can give you for using this camera when you first get it. They do apply to anything with a scene meter like this, but they are things that I think will help you be set up to make the most out of this camera when you use it. A couple things not to do with your camera. Don't store it with the shutter armed. So whenever you're done for the day, even if it means wasting a shot, that's fine. Waste the shot. Disarm your shutter. The reason for that is because when you arm the shutter like this, what happens is that it's putting a bunch of springs under tension. And if you let the springs sit under tension overnight, or if you think I'm going to come back to it tomorrow, but you forget and it's a week or a month later, those springs risk, especially as they get older, developing a memory, which means that it can throw off the shutter timing. And if you want to see what that looks like, let's go down here to half a second. And that was a little bit more than a 1-second shot. When I did the 1-second exposure earlier and it was clocking in at around 8 seconds, that sort of thing can very easily happen from springs that have developed a memory. It can also happen from thick grease that's in the mechanism, but at any rate. So always, always, always disarm your shutter before you set it aside at the end of the day. Next thing is, don't let your camera get wet. Everything inside of it is metal. These are very well made. They're metal, but that metal can rust. So if your camera gets wet, that can lead to your mechanisms rusting together, which will ruin your camera. It's not weather sealed, so don't take it out in the rain. If you are in the rain, try to keep it protected from the water. Don't leave your camera in your car. In addition to that being a really good way for it to get stolen, let's say it's not. Let's say it spends a year in your car. It's going to get really, really hot in that time. And the oils that keep your camera lens lubricated will get very thin, and they'll get to places they shouldn't be, like the shutter leaves. And then when they get back to their normal temperature, it's going to throw off the way that your camera operates. Also, it could get really cold. And even if your lens oils don't get very thin, if they get cold, they can turn gummy and break down, and that can also cause your shutter timing to be thrown off, like making a 1-second exposure an 8-second exposure. So just remember, also don't keep your camera in a plastic bag or box unless you have a rechargeable desiccant pack that you keep recharged, because plastic is permeable. And if moisture gets into that plastic, it will find a home in this covering or on your lens or within your viewfinder, and that can cause mildew to grow inside the covering, which is not pleasant when you put it up to your nose, or fungus to grow on your lens optics, which can affect your image performance and your lens's ability to take sharp images. So just remember that your Yashica Lynx-1000 is a precision tool that should be handled with care and respect. And as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.